The prairie wind had a voice. Alara had known this since she was a child, tending the sheep on the vast, rolling expanse of her family's claim. It wasn't just a sound, it was a language. It whispered through the blue stem grass, sighed around the corners of the sod house, and sang a low, thrumming song against the stretched hide of the drum her grandfather had made. Most people heard only a monotonous rush of air, but Alara listened. She heard stories in it, stories of the buffalo that were gone, of the tribes that had followed them, of the land itself, ancient and patient. Lately, however, the whispers had changed. It began as a dissonant note, a thread of anxiety woven into the usual melodies. The wind, which usually carried the scents of sage and damp earth, now sometimes brought a faint, acrid taint that made the sheep restless. Alara tried to mention it to her pa over supper of rabbit stew and hardtack. "The wind's talking strange," she said, her spoon hovering mid-air. Her pa, a man whose face was as weathered and lined as the land he worked, grunted. "Wind's just wind, Ellie girl. It's your imagination. You've always had too much of it." He gestured with his chin towards the single, precious book on the shelf, a collection of myths and legends. "Fill in your head with nonsense." But it wasn't nonsense. The whispers grew more urgent over the following days. They were no longer just stories of the past. They were warnings about the future. They spoke of a bleeding in the earth, a sickness coming from the north. Alara would stand on the rise behind the house, her skirts whipping around her legs, and strain to understand. The words were elusive, like trying to catch smoke. Then the sheep started to die. It wasn't predators. There were no tracks, no signs of a struggle. They simply grew listless, their eyes clouding over, and then they would lie down and not get up. The first one was a shock. The fifth was a catastrophe. Their claimed survival depended on the wool and meat from the flock. Pa's worry turned to a grim, silent fury. He blamed a plague, poisoned water, anything solid he could maim. But Alara knew. She knelt by the last dead ewe, placing her hand on its still warm side, and closed her eyes. The prairie wind swirled around her, and this time the whisper was clear. "The stone bleeds. It poisons the water beneath the grass. The roots drink death." Her eyes snapped open. She looked north, towards the barren, rocky hills where no one went. The old tales called it the breathless land, a place where even the wind grew quiet. "Pa," she said that evening, her voice trembling but firm, "the sickness is coming from the North Hills. There's something there, a stone that's poisoning the water." Her pa slammed his hand on the table. "Enough, Alara. There's no magic stone. There's no talking wind. We have real problems. The Barclays are circling like vultures, just waiting for us to fail so they can add our claim to theirs. I need solutions, not fairy stories." Tears stung Alara's eyes, but a stubborn resolve hardened within her. If he wouldn't listen, she would have to prove it. Before dawn the next day, with the wind whimpering a cautionary tune, she filled a water skin, tucked her grandfather's bone-handled knife into her belt, and set out towards the North Hills. The journey was harsh. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the friendly, whispering prairie gave way to a stark, silent landscape of cracked earth and jagged rocks. The air grew still and heavy. It was true. The wind did not blow here. The silence was deafening, a pressure on the ears. She followed a dry creek bed, her own footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. After hours of walking, she found it. In a small, desolate canyon, a strange, obsidian-like stone, about the size of a wagon wheel, jutted from the ground. It was unlike any rock she had ever seen. From a hairline crack in its surface seeped a thin, iridescent fluid that pooled sluggishly before trickling down into the earth. The ground around it was bare and cracked, and a faint, sickly sweet odor hung in the air, the same smell she'd caught on the wind. This was the bleeding stone. This was the source of the poison. But as she approached, the silence was broken, not by the wind, but by a low, guttural growl. From behind a boulder emerged a creature she had only heard described in her grandfather's stories. It was a prairie wraith, a beast of dust and shadow, with glowing amber eyes and horns like twisted juniper. It was a guardian, a spirit of the desolate places, drawn to the stone's corrupting energy. Alara froze, her heart pounding. The wraith paced before the stone, its form seeming to shift and shimmer. She had no weapon that could harm such a thing. But as she stood there paralyzed, a memory surfaced, her grandfather's voice, soft by the fire. The old things, the wild things, they understand the true songs, the songs of the earth. The wind. She couldn't hear it here, but she could remember it. She could feel its echo in her bones. Closing her eyes, she began to hum. It was the song the wind sang over the wildflowers in the spring, a light, hopeful melody. The wraith stopped its pacing, its head tilting. She pushed her voice louder, weaving in the low, resonant thrum of the storm wind, the playful dance of the breeze through the cottonwoods. She sang the prairie's song back to it, a song of life and growth and connection. The wraith's growl softened to a rumble. The hostile glow in its eyes dimmed. It watched her, no longer a threat, but a curious listener. Slowly it lowered its head, then turned and melted back into the shadows of the canyon, becoming one with the dust and rock. Alara approached the stone. The poison was the problem. The whispers had told her the roots were drinking death. She couldn't stop the bleeding, but perhaps she could cleanse the poison. She uncorked her water skin. It was just water, but it was water from the well at home, water that had fallen as rain on healthy land. It was a symbol of life. She poured it slowly, carefully, onto the seeping crack in the stone. A hiss of steam erupted, and the iridescent fluid seemed to recoil. She poured until the water skin was empty. It was a tiny, futile gesture against such a vast poison. But as the last drop fell, a miracle happened. A breeze stirred. It was faint at first, just a whisper of movement that stirred the dust at her feet. Then it grew stronger, flowing into the breathless canyon like a returning tide. It swirled around her, cool and clean, carrying the familiar scent of home. It swirled around the bleeding stone, and as it did, the iridescent seepage slowed, then stopped. The dark surface seemed to dull, the cracks sealing over, as if healed by an invisible hand. The task was done. Exhausted, Alara turned for home. She arrived as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in fiery hues. Her pa was on the porch, his face etched with a day of worry and anger. But as she stumbled towards him,
He saw the dust on her dress, the exhaustion in her face, and the quiet certainty in her eyes. He didn't speak. He simply followed her gaze towards the north. And then he heard it. The wind was back to its old song, the gentle, rhythmic whisper through the grass. The anxious, discordant note was gone. The next morning, the remaining sheep were grazing peacefully. A week later, new green shoots were pushing through the soil near the dry creek bed. Pa never again said the wind was just wind. He would often stand on the porch with Alara in the evenings, listening. He didn't hear the stories she did, but he heard the peace in it. He understood now that his daughter's connection to the land was not nonsense, but a deeper kind of sense. The whispers in the prairie